Good morning. My name is Marie Gerges, and welcome to our first academic panel of the day. Referencing a notable lyric from Cardinal Official's 2001 Bacardi slang, this panel is titled My Style Off the Thermostat, Plus I'm Coming from the Cold, Identity and Meaning Making in Toronto Hip-Hop, an effort to explore the ways in which Toronto rappers have used rap music to tell their unique stories, negotiate identity, and create a narrative belonging to the Canadian state. This panel will feature 4 budding hip-hop academics and will be moderated by Tapo, a PhD student in the Faculty of Education at York University. Tapo has practiced psychotherapy for several years and holds a master's in psychoanalytical psychotherapy that she earned in Dublin, Ireland. Her current research is on psychoanalytic race theories. That's a mouthful. I will now turn the panel over to Tapo, who will introduce each academic presentation.
Thank you. Our first presentation is from Del Cowie, a Toronto-based music journalist and online editor who has written for Vibe, XXL, iWeekly, The Grid, and CBC Music. Cowie is currently an assistant editor at the Canadian monthly music magazine, Exclaim. The title of Del's paper is Remixing, Let Your Backbone Slide. Please join me in welcoming Del Cowie.
All right, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. So thanks to everyone who is involved in presenting this conference. It's a great event just to have a dialogue on this topic. So I guess basically what I'm going to talk about here is remixing Let Your Backbone Slide. Of course, I guess this is the title of my paper. Before I get into it really though, I do want to ask, I guess I'm assuming you know what I mean when I say let your backbone slide. I don't want to assume, everything else. Okay, so everyone is familiar with that song. How many of you guys know all the lyrics to that song? The first verse, maybe? Second? Okay, I don't know. All right, so, everyone kind of is familiar with the fact that, when this, familiar with this song, it's actually, because it's one of the very first Canadian hip-hop songs to actually gain any kind of widespread recognition. So it's a good time to go back and actually look at some of our history in it to actually kind of see how that might inform what's going on now and then also into the future. So I guess that's where we're going to start off for this. So for many Canadians from varying age groups, generations, and backgrounds, the song Let Your Backbone Slide represents an indelible encounter and experience with hip-hop culture from within their own borders. The song is lauded for its pioneering commercial success, influence, and status as a party anthem. Yet, as far as I know, it's rarely been considered beyond those parameters. So I am aiming to take a closer look at the song so we can derive some meanings that can enable us to gain a better understanding, interpretation, and contextualization of hip-hop from Toronto. And I'll hope to examine some themes of diaspora, popular culture, and community, and how they intersect with the longevity and the historical relevance of the song. So also, I'm not under any illusion that backbone, because I'm going to refer to it as backbone for the rest of this, because I can't keep saying let your backbone slide. But I'm not under any illusion that this was the first Canadian hip-hop song ever, because it wasn't. Maestro was definitely not the first MC or significant MC to emerge from the city, but it's a good, I think, point where we can kind of start from. It's a record that a lot of people can recognize, and you can kind of use it as a launching pad for some of these ideas. So, just move along here. Okay. So, yeah, this presentation, so these are some of the aims of kind of what I want to do here. Contextualize the importance of it, and explore the themes, and discuss implications. So I want to give a few notes on the impact of Let Your Backbone Slide. Here we have the album cover for Symphony in Effect, the album that the song was taken from, that was released in 1989. Backbone was the best-selling Canadian hip-hop single for over 20 years. I'm not sure at this point, if Drake has actually beaten that within the borders of Canada. I know that in the States definitely has, but I would imagine he's been pretty close or beaten it, but I honestly don't know, like, the updated SoundScan things. But regardless, the record was released in 1989. Up until at least 2008, it was still the best-selling Canadian hip-hop single. So that's still a very notable feat for over 20 years. So this album here, Symphony in Effect, also went platinum on its release, and that it was actually the first time that had ever happened for a Black Canadian artist. The single also helped to spur the Juno Awards to actually create a category for rap music that didn't exist at all when Let Your Backbone Slide was released. When it was actually released, the Junos that actually occurred that year, they didn't know what to do with. Well, they did know what to do with it. They put it in the dance recording category. So Maestro was up against Candy in the Backbeat, Yada Yada, and Con-Can. Yeah, I don't know if anyone remembers any of those groups, but anyway, but they were markedly different in terms of the type of music. I mean, it's dance music, but it's not hip hop. So the next year they decided to create a rap recording category based on the actual, success of the song, and actually because it had been so successful. And that next year, Maestro actually got 5 nominations in the Juno Awards. I do know that before I kind of get too deep into Junos, we know that the Juno Awards and hip hop have had a very rocky relationship in Canada. But at that point in time, Maestro did get 5 nominations, and he did win 2 awards. And there was a best hip hop recording category, and there were no prizes for guessing who won that. So, but I did want to mention the dance recording thing a bit, because that's kind of like what the perception of the song was. The perception of the dance single, of it being a dance record, kind of went back to that attitude of it. That was the category we were going to put it in when it was released. And the truth be told, I mean, the song is called, there is an order to dance at some point in the song. It's in the chorus and everything, but there's a little bit more to it than that. In my role as a music journalist, I've interviewed Maestro a few times over the years, and when we've discussed it, on a couple of occasions, I've discussed this record with him, and the topic of dancing rarely comes up. On one occasion, I asked Maestro what his intention was when he actually made this record. And I'm not sure if you guys can see that. I'm sorry for the quote being so long, but this is kind of what he was saying, for anyone who can't. So I know you shouldn't read what it says on the slide, but I'll do it anyway. So it says, what I was thinking when I was writing the song was, it was just about Toronto, really. My whole vibe, my world was Toronto. So my whole thing was just that we're trying to blow up out of Toronto. My whole vibe is I'm coming out and I'm saying something, and it's just as good or it's better than anyone in my city. You're going to hear me. That was my mentality back then. If you actually see the video for Let Your Backbone Slide, I think most people who are familiar with the song, probably that was your main medium of actually hearing the song. You might notice that Maestro rarely smiles in this video at all. He actually sounds like he's very I have to prove something here. And it's it's interesting that we actually think that this is there's a perception this is a song about dancing and kind of like having a good time, but he's not smiling. So it's like he's actually really trying to make a point here in terms of articulating his identity. And as hip hop has mushroomed in popularity around the world into a global phenomenon, there's been a growth since Maestro released this record, up until this point, in what people have termed global hip hop studies. I think one of the first, there have been a number of books, a number of theories that have been bandied about. But I wanted to use one of the earlier ones here to talk about this record. There's an anthology that you probably, or many of you may be familiar with, called Global Noise. And Mitchell, who was the writer, who edited that anthology, stated a cyclical process that, in the way that hip hop develops outside of the United States. Basically, it says that at first, in the initial stages, hip hop attempts to emulate the US model. And after some point, it goes from adoption to adaption, basically. So, people stop trying to actually imitate what is coming from the US, which is obviously the origin of where this music comes from. And then after a while, begins to incorporate their own local environment and their cultural themes and ideals into their music, and then ends up differentiating and coming up with their own style. This concurrent process is often referred to as a global process, combining global and local elements at the same time. For Canadians, this process is particularly intensive because of the spatial and physical proximity to the United States. The influence of US hip-hop on hip-hop coming from Canada, and more specifically Toronto, is, in this case, crystallized by the fact that many hip-hop aficionados, including Maestro's own father, go across the border to go get records and to kind of come back, so there's this flow. In fact, it's possible to argue that Maestro's record actually evolves through this entire process in the 5 minutes that the song actually goes on. Looks like I'm going to run out of time here, so I'm going to skip a couple of things. But what I will say is that the introduction of the song on the first, so let's just go into, I'm going to step a section here. So to go through the song a little bit very quickly here, the first verse and the intro actually shows you some of basically what they're trying to do in the song is actually trying to make it valid. He's coming from Canada, so he's trying to basically use codes, sonic codes that will actually say, I'm a valid hip hop artist. So this song is one of them. So the reason I'm bringing this record into this conversation, obviously, is that it's sampled in Let Your Backbone Slide. It's a distinctive Hammond organ riff that punctuates the chorus, and it's itself derived from Tramp, which is an Otis Redding song. Actually, it's not an Otis Redding song. It's an Otis Redding covering another song by Lowell Fulson. But the reason why it's important is because Eric B. and Rakim made a song called Eric B. for President that was out previous to Let Your Backbone Slide. So Maestro was actually using these sonic cues to make sure that he was actually seen as a valid hip-hop artist. Also, you're hearing this. 1, 2, 3, okay. That never gets old, but the funky drummer, you hear that in the instrumental section that follows the a cappella intro of the song before Maestro begins its first verse. And few samples will affirm your hip hop validity more than Funky Drummer, which is perhaps the single most exploited sample in hip hop music history, according to Joe Schloss. But we know this because it's used so many times. But it's important because you hear this for a full minute before Maestro starts to rhyme. So actually saying, okay, this is actually really important. So anyway, okay, all right. So throughout the first verse, what we do here is Maestro doing what you feel he's using is wordplay to get to show kind of basically. There's a lot of theory out there from artists. from theorists like Imani Perry and Russell Potter, people like that, who actually have talked about how the aesthetics of what people are rhyming about it's not necessarily bragging. It's not bragging. It's signifying and using techniques like that. And Maestro does a lot of that, but what he also does is basically use his own autobiographical story. In the first verse, he talks about. I'm not actually going to play this clip because I might not have any time, but this is actually a reference to football running patterns. Maestro attended Carleton University and was a football player. So he's basically actually talking about his own transition from being a football player, because these are references to football running patterns, no X's or O's or tic-tac-toes, basically, and talking about how he's now becoming an MC. So he's drawing on his own identity to actually create his own space. As it moves into the second verse, he talks more about, this is a lyric that most people actually kind of point out in this song here. Like I said before, I'm not American. And that's now after, in the second verse, he's reifying a lot of these techniques that I've said can be seen as bragging and just being kind of generally outlandish to some people's minds. But what he's also doing is now he references Swiss francs, he references all these other things. It's like an international thing. And then he actually talks about his own nationality, but doesn't say he's Canadian. He actually says, I'm not American, but doesn't actually assert his own identity. And that's actually really important in some ways. So I'm going to skip a couple. I'm going to conclude. had much more, but anyway. But the other thing is also, there's him actually acknowledging that he's American, or that he wasn't American, or that he was Canadian. Actually, would probably be in a death knell to his career. And at that point in time, that kind of shows you how far we've kind of come in terms of Toronto hip hop, where that's actually probably seen as an asset today. So in the final verse, what we do see is what Maestro. Well, in the final verse, what we do get is Maestro saying the key word is synchronism, and it is unity is a theme. Basically, what he's done now is actually he's created his own self-identity. In the second verse, he's now drawing on this diasporic kind of environment, and now he's actually crystallizing it. He's got the tuxedo on, he's got the conductor stick, and he's basically bringing things together. And also, once he's done that, he's also now actually interrogating traditional, conventional notions of what popular music are. The third verse has many references to classical music, and basically he reconfigures them. He takes words like forte and fortissimo and changes the meaning for his own sake. And that's basically him subverting traditional notions of what popular music is and specifically in Canada as well. So within all three verses, you kind of start with this imitative kind of, drawing on the American influence of hip hop, and then as it goes, it goes through these different themes. All the while he seems like he's just bragging and partying, there are these themes that are kind of underlying in the lyrics. So I just kind of wanted to highlight that in this presentation. So it's the end point after the cyclical process of emulating, articulating, crystallizing hip hop identity. As we move forward and the Toronto scene becomes more prominent as an internationally recognized hip hop center, it will be interesting to explore if theories and ideas like the one I've applied here become more applicable, or will they lose resonance in favor of newer approaches? So Let Your Backbone Slide has not been seen beyond its title, an exhortation or a demand to get on the dance floor, which is not a trivial pursuit by any means. But what I've hoped to show here is that the song incorporates and utilizes elements of the cycle that facilitate the development of hip hop cultures, from digesting it whole to creating something new. This might not be as apparent when the automatic reaction of hearing the song might be just to recite the lyrics, which is an understandable reaction. But hopefully looking at the song differently here has shown that there's much more to the song, to the eye and to the ear. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Del Cowie. Our second presentation will be from Audrey Hudson, an educator who currently teaches at OCAD University and is a first-year PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, Ontario Institute for the Study of Education, OAZ. Audrey is interested in the intersection between the arts and urban environments. The title of Audrey's paper is Narratives in Hip Hop, Solidarity in Idle No More. Please join me in welcoming Audrey Hudson.
So thank you for Francesca and the committee for having me here. So I'm going to present, my paper is on narratives in hip hop, and yeah, that's the title, Narratives in Hip Hop, Solidarity in Idle No More. So sorry. Yeah, perfect, thank you. Okay, good. So I want to begin with a bit of a history of a friendship that saved lives. This friendship was special and unique in that it grew out of a bond formed between two groups of oppressed people, each helping the other. But for like any other relationship, this was one that saw unjust and antagonistic acts. But for the most part, this was an alliance based in solidarity and freedom. This historical relationship influenced both groups in significant sociocultural aspects that carry on today. I'm talking about the solidarity that was formed between African Americans and Aboriginal communities during the time of slavery. So in the late 16th and 17th century, the Mohawks came in contact with black slaves as Europeans brought them to Turtle Island. The Mohawks were involved in a version of the Underground Railroad. In the late 1600s, they offered a safe haven for runaway slaves. Many Mohawks had witnessed slavery in some form, either as being captives themselves or witnessing Africans being enslaved. And this is from Richard Hill Sr., which I've got a couple of quotes on the slide there. So essentially, slavery brought these two groups together and made them comrades in the struggle. So I see this alliance that was formed centuries ago being regenerated through the contemporary subculture of hip-hop. So my aim is to think through notions of solidarity between these two marginalized groups and examine how the narrative qualities of the music shape an alliance around a struggle. And I use the definition of solidarity as theorized by Bayerts, which claims one is in solidarity with those to whom one is close to due to some common ground, so a shared history, shared feelings, convictions, or interests, as can be seen between Black and Aboriginal communities. So my paper examines the socio-political role of the hip-hop artist in the Idle No More movement. So it is rooted, my work is rooted in a cultural studies framework with a social justice pedagogy that speaks to hip-hop and its different capacities. So I am not a hip-hop artist, but I have mad love and respect for the sophisticated language that my Jamaican brothers began with in the Bronx over 30 years ago. As an African Canadian with Jamaican heritage, hip-hop resonates with me as much as reggae does. So both forms were born out of a struggle of young Black voices rooted in social justice. And over the past 20 years of my engagement with hip-hop, my love of this music, I have come to view this culture as a critical educational tool for the decolonizing work I am beginning to embark on. And in this time, I have witnessed the global impact of this music and have listened to how other marginalized groups utilize this art form as a means to declare their unheard voices. In this context, I shed light on how Aboriginal rappers claim their unheard voices in the poetics of hip-hop. With this proclamation of voice, they became supporters in socio-political voices behind Idle No More. So Idle No More is a nationwide movement on First Nations, for First Nations communities to help build sovereignty and resurgence. Idle No More is a response to Bill C-45, which threatened land and water safety and made amendments to the bill without consulting First Nations people whom it deeply affected. So this movement began in Saskatchewan with a group of 4 women doing a teach-in about the omnibus budget legislation, and specifically Bill C-45. So Idle No More brought alliances together with a shared concern to stand up for the rights of First Nations communities. During the height of this movement, many Aboriginal rappers became activists through their artistic practice. So hip hop was and is their voice to speak about the inequities of their lives, and specifically they were speaking about Bill C-45. And you may remember the protests and everything that the whole move, if you're from Toronto or if you're wherever you're from, you may remember all the movement that went on starting in December, and it's still going on now. And although in my work, which centers around hip-hop education, I do acknowledge the murky reputation of hip-hop, but my goal is to shed light on the goodness that can be taken from this powerful art form and moved into a curriculum that speaks about silenced voices. So these silenced voices are what Susan Dion names in the text Telling Stories, where she believes in the act of retelling and reconstructing racist colonial stories and narratives from the past as a means to present truths. And like what Francesca was saying at the beginning, thinking about whose narratives are told, whose are not, and why, of course. So I believe that this phenomenon of hip-hop should be conceived as a meaningful form of teaching to further investigate the narrative colonial histories. We could begin with a critical analysis and discussion around whose histories are taught, whose voices are heard, whose are left out, and why. All of this through hip-hop education. So I'd like to bring it back now to the hip-hop artist as a socio-political voice in Idle No More, in the Idle No More movement, and examine the educative potential of this. So as Bayard states, is solidarities between two groups or persons that share a certain feeling or experience, conviction or interest. And it is here that the cultures intersect to become an alliance. It is that shared emotion of being voiceless that, where rap music comes alive, as many of you can attest to. So MCs speak out and share emotion, frustration, inequities, marginalization, and also better times to come. So rap is a platform for artists to take the stage and have others listen. We can just even think of a cipher. That's what it's for. You get into a circle and everyone listens to your rhyme. So Black and Aboriginal communities have a history of not being listened to. So rapping is a vehicle to tell their lived experience. So many, as I said, so many artists, so many Aboriginal rappers came to took up the call to arms, basically, to shed light on the Idle No More movement through rap. And I'll show a specific clip from Plex. He's a local rapper who raps about Idle No More and mixes in a sound clip even from John Lennon, speaking of socio-political artists, who also acknowledged the shared Black and Native communities, the shared inequities of these two communities.
It's a bit mean, you know. But we always used to stick up for the Indians in Britain on the movies, you know.
How many
People
votes?
think there's only a few Indians left. There's millions of them in the whole continent of America, which includes South America. And one day they're going to be asking for their rights. I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't standing next to the black people too. So it's either give now or die later, I reckon.
Say it loud, we native and proud, we're waiting it out. The best day to be native is now. It is what it gotta be, hurt the economy. Whatever it takes to get the PM in front of me. Government still a real fucking terrorist. Ever since they came to the Americas, bringing guns to a peaceful protest. Target the hopeless, weak and oppressed. They all cannibals, filthy animals. And if you figure that's cool, it's understandable. But try to walk a block in my shoes and talk to the cop with the Glock behind you. They all cowards, hungry for power. Ain't satisfied till the land's been devoured. Vampires, they out for blood. They chop trees and they run pipe right through the mud. They say we drill oil cause we need it. They figure we're sheep, we'll believe it. They treat treaties like shit, we're mistreated. We only want what's ours and that's freedom. Freedom, freedom. Making our move, we ain't gonna idle no more. We ain't gonna idle no more. Making our move, we ain't gonna idle no more. We ain't gonna idle no more. Call me Christmas, cause I'm forgiven, but I can't forget the state in which native people are living. The government would rather see us dead or in prison.
Okay. Okay, so that was just a minute of the clip, but you can see that that Plex is taking his role as the artist and taking a socio-political stand on what is going on with his people. So this was Plex, and there's Wab Canoe, A Tribe Called Red, Relic. These are all artists that have taken up this call to action. So rap is a form of social activism, and it translates in the strength in light of the Idle No More movement. And I view this as a prime example to begin thinking and teaching through hip hop, and think about collaborations rooted in a critical pedagogy. So Micmac lawyer Pam Palmater stated that we come together in solidarity to let people know that this is not okay, and that we have a voice and that we can't be taken advantage of. So this is from a CBC clip where Dr. Palmater is a spokesperson for one of the spokespersons for the Idle No More movement, and she's speaking about her people. So, as an educator, so I aim to question the form of socio-political work that can be taken up as an educative tool. So hip-hop education calls to action Ladson Billings' concept of culturally relevant pedagogy, where hip-hop can be utilized to teach histories of relationship between the African diaspora and Aboriginal communities. So the educative force of this medium is definitely on the rise, and with this engagement, we will be able to shed light on the similarities and polarities of these two struggles and examine how they can be turned into a curriculum rooted in social justice. So these artists are telling stories, they're restating, re-implementing, reclaiming, remapping, reimagining, rewriting, and reframing their own stories. And as Dion states, stories have always been valued as a means of teaching and learning within First Nations communities. They are not just entertainment, but power. And I think we need to take that from hip hop. These stories that people are telling, these lived stories are definitely powerful. So, and also stories are valued with high esteem by African communities, where you gather around to listen to a history lesson from an elder who has actually lived it. And although I acknowledge that rap is not the only way to educate youth, I do argue that it is one of many ways to garner attention through a music that they are listening to. Technology and media is a platform for us to keep it alive and rekindle alliances and move forward together. Educators can use the videos that are uploaded onto websites or YouTube to teach about Idle No More and discuss the origins of this movement, to critically examine and analyze the intentions and motivations behind it. And I do believe that Idle No More has at least invigorated our hope, proven by the hunger strike of Chief Teresa Spence from Attawapiskat, proven by the numerous round dances that took place all over the nation, and proven by the heroic journey the heroic youth in the journey of Nishnu, where seven youth took it upon themselves to walk all the way from the Cree community in Quebec to Ottawa to let the Prime Minister know, to let our government know about the inequities and about their statement behind this. So they're telling Ottawa that they are not idle by any means. And the movement definitely instigated a sense of political action and a call to take a stance. So just to return to the narrative in the beginning of my paper with the Mohawk Nation and Black slaves, there was an alliance and a solidarity between these two communities in a time of necessity. And I think that Idle No More has rekindled this friendship and motivated non-Aboriginal people to stand in solidarity with First Nation communities to let the government know that this is not okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey Hudson. Our third presentation will be from A.W. Lee, a PhD student in cultural studies at Queen's University. A.W.'s work explores scientific, social, and performative embodiments of masculinity, Asian diasporic identity, and queer identities in hip-hop culture. The title of A.W.'s paper is Hip-Hop Never Embraced Faggots, Queer Hip-Hop Diaspora in Toronto. Please join me in welcoming A.W. Lee.
Hi. I just wanted to just warn all y'all that there will be explicit lyrics in this. So I wanted to begin this with a video of myself. I'm primarily a rap musician and performance artist, and I was lucky enough to be given the chance to do an autoethnographic PhD in cultural studies about myself. And I could talk endlessly about myself, but I just wanted to, I won't. I just wanted to situate myself first as an artist and tell you this is what I do, this is what I sound like, and have you think about that. I won't play the whole thing. It's called Broke Back That Ass Up. It's set in the very non-urban setting of rural Quebec.
Broke back in sheepskin, best skin, no pubs or inns. My one-night friend is closest kin. No DNA inheritance, just seed and breeding brethren. We herding sheep, romancing deep. We get no sleep, tea bags are steeped. In this tent, you straight or bent. It just don't matter when we butt man, yeah. We look good, broke back that ass up. You a fine motherfucker, broke back that ass up. You know what's so good, broke back that ass up. Living for your wood, broke back that ass up. Back that ass up, back that ass up. Run my firewood, broke back that ass up. 'Cause you know I'll do it good. You my and I still more, I pick you up in my truck. Jump start your quest, stick shift your up.
So because of time, I won't play the whole thing. If we have enough time at the end, I'll play it. But essentially, this paper is just a fraction of what I hope to explore in my PhD, and the claim that I want to make first and foremost is that against the very common assumption that hip hop is inherently homophobic and unfriendly to gays, I want to claim that that hip hop, there's already been queer potential in hip hop culture, rap music. So the title of the paper comes from a quote. You can easily find a lot of quotes about homophobia in hip hop. It's sort of common sense knowledge, but this is from Immortal Technique. It wasn't a slight against queers or the LGBT community. He was just asked about homophobia in hip hop, and he gave a straight up answer. As for homophobia, hip hop never embraced faggots. One can't deny that there are probably rappers, DJs, and fans who are homos, but I think since the culture was based around proving one's manhood, and that's important, acting like a fruit pop isn't going to get you anywhere. And again, that wasn't meant as a slight, given in the context of the interview against gay people or queers or transgender people, but rather the just a straight up answer about the state of hip hop in 2005. In 2012, however, here we go. Oops. 2012, however, it was a bit of a watershed moment for queers in hip hop, because beginning with, many people cite the coming out of Frank Ocean. Even though he's not specifically a rapper, he is associated with hip hop, Odd Future, for example, and there were titles of articles like "The Year Hip Hop Went Queer," there were important articles in Pitchfork and Details about openly queer rappers, specifically. In southern United States, as well as California, but most predominantly in New York, and so this opened up a dialogue in various ways to talk about homophobia. But what unsettled me and continues to unsettle me is this sort of assumption of hip hop being inherently unfriendly to queers is it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it does if you think about the predominance of homophobic language like faggot and dyke, tranny less so, but mostly faggot. That's a big one. But it's, I think it's an oversimplification of that. So, if there is something inherently unfriendly to queer people in hip hop, that's not specific to hip hop. It's something that is everywhere, in every institution of popular television, film, marriage inequality, etc. Like the military, anything that can exclude is inherently homophobic. So to describe hip hop as exceptionally so is problematic. So these are so Mers or Nick Carter describes it as an overall anti-homosexual sentiment, and in one of the articles I referenced, hip-hop is described as the last bastion of homophobia in popular culture, which is ridiculous because it's everywhere, So the fact that there are queer artists, there are queer rappers, DJs, dancers in hip-hop proves that the rule is wrong, and I wanted to describe the ways in which queers who are practicing, who are DJing, who are MCing, do embrace and remix elements of hip hop that I believe were always already potentially queer in the first place. Just needed some gays to bring it out. So this is Leaf standing in the corner, not in the Pikachu mask. He's a proud gay man. I am gay, and I'm proud to be called a gay rapper, but it's not gay rap. That's not a genre, and I agree with that. I agree that sexuality is a weak, linker for a musical genre, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing similar being done, because Leaf is different from me, is different from hip-hop artists, Jazz and Sae Sky in Toronto, is different from Big Frida in Louisiana. We're all very different in our sound, in what we do, our aesthetic, etc. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing similar. So, just to step broadly for a moment, like Del mentioned in his presentation, there are many ways to describe hip hop outside of America and outside of New York, and without going into detail about, because Del did mention the multiple narratives of adaptation outside of New York. It has been hip-hop, regardless of whether or not you describe it within a single narrative of New York, 1970s, etc., being imitated elsewhere, or multiple narratives of mutation and adaptation in many areas of the world. New York is very important. It's been described as so all of these different scenes in Japan, in Brazil, in Canada, in North Africa, all of these scenes can be considered a hip-hop diaspora in a symbolic way. And so, like all other diasporas, we always look back home, right, to a home lost. In psychoanalytic theory, but also important to the notion of home is the idea of Black Atlantic music tradition. So essentially, what I wanted to say on this slide was that it's exciting mashing up cultures, especially in Toronto with a very multi-ethnic demographic. Michimi, Cardinal, bringing dance hall into hip hop aesthetics in Canada, making it sonically very interesting. But what's interesting about queer hip hop artists is that you add an additional layer of displacement, not just displacement from the home of hip hop, not just displacement from Africa, but also displacement from moral and legal frameworks of citizenship. With respect to deviant sexuality, or what's often considered deviant sexuality. So with respect to the idea of progress, there is a notion among queer hip hop artists, because there's an impulse to differentiate ourselves, not be lumped together, to pray for the idea that in the future we don't even have to consider ourselves gay rappers. So for Jazz, who is an Egyptian-born, Kuwait-raised Canadian rap artist, the idea of the queer hip-hop movement is that eventually we don't even have to say we're queer rappers. Cakes Tequila, who's one of the more prominent queers from New York, he's says to finally get to a point where heterosexual, oh that's misspelled, rappers aren't the only ones getting press is amazing, but as far as queerness, personally, I don't consider myself to be a queer or a queer artist, because gay rap is not a genre. But that's not to say that I don't, personally, I see a familiarity between queer sexuality and hip hop. So while we're not exactly fitting the mold because we're openly gay and we openly talk about it unapologetically, we're not exactly busting out of the tropes of hip hop either, you know? So for example, Jazz, I would situate her work in similar struggle-based representational work, like Michelle Ndegeocello, Deep Dick Collective, all of these queer artists who use and parallel the notion of struggle for representing their own personal struggles. In Dalton Higgins' hip-hop world, he refers to things like reservation rap, post-apartheid rap, etc. Masculinity, however, is another thing for that queer sexuality, it put in conversation with hip-hop, provokes and reorganizes notions of masculinity that are typically presented in hip hop. So proving one's manhood is important, and that's important, especially important with respect to historic simultaneous emasculation and hyper sexualization of black male masculinity. And so for a lot of queers, the idea of playing with notions of intrinsic masculinity is important, or is a tool to which one can subvert notions of intrinsic masculinity. So there was stuff about Jazz, but I will talk about myself. For my work, I used to be a burlesque dancer, and so rapping actually grew out of chanting for me, because you're not supposed to talk on stage as a stripper, I guess. And but when I grabbed the mic, I started chanting like Two Live Crew. So instead of saying, "Hey, we want some pussy," I would go, "Hey, give me your mussy," and so very simple sort of chants to get the crowd going. Typically an all male crowd, and. It's a flip of the script of sexuality, masculinity, masculine aggression, which in as I grew as a lyricist, I took a lot of notes from very very hypersexual ladies in rap. Trina, Lil' Kim, so a line in her song "Suck My Dick," all I want to do is get my pussy sucked. It flips the script of male phallocentric masculinity and refers to the moral panic that surrounds black sexuality and hip hop. So I will end there, and I just wanted to reiterate that my point is there's so many elements about hip hop that are potentially already queer that it's not inherently and exceptionally more homophobic than any other institution. Thanks.
Thank you, A.W. Lee. Our final presentation will be from Ola Mohammed, who is a PhD student in social and political thought here at York University. The title of Ola's paper is "My Poetry Hails Within the Streets. My Poetry Fails to be Discreet," examining issues of belonging and identity in Southern Ontario diasporic hip-hop music. Please join me in welcoming Ola Mohammed.
In the first 5 seconds of the Canadian hip-hop duo Dream Warriors' classic, My Definition of a Boombastic Jazz Style, King Lou and Capital Q draw from their desire to create multiple sites of identification for their audiences by sampling a rhythm that is as complicated in belonging to the nation as Black Canadians. Their strategic use of Quincy Jones's soul bossa nova highlights how identity is constructed via cultural references, as the instrumental could be recognized from the 15-year-long Canadian television series Definition, while simultaneously being a product of elsewhere. By employing the emerging urban musical form hip-hop, Dream Warriors announced the struggle Black diasporic Canadians faced in belonging to the nation due to the fact that multiculturalism frames how one should officially belong to the nation. Rather than ascribing to the wide range of social articulations that multiculturalism reduces for those who are framed as others, Dream Warriors use hip-hop to map and question the difficulties of belonging to the nation's core. Dream Warriors were pioneers in Black diasporic Canadian hip-hop because they recognized that the new urban expressive culture provided a public forum that could nourish audiences by offering community membership that entails a body of cultural knowledge, as well as offering a counter-hegemonic authority and subjectivity. In the mid-2000s, What is evident in both past and present of diasporic Canadian hip-hop are dialogues about Canada's difficulty in locating a Black presence within. This paper seeks to critically examine how contemporary Black diasporic Canadian hip-hop musicians creatively map their struggles in belonging to the nation, rather than falling into the seductiveness of a multicultural discourse that accepts and simultaneously silences difference for the purpose of nation building. I argue that Black diasporic Canadian artists continue to use hip-hop to communicate the tension of being outside insiders to the nation. In doing so, the artists invent imagined communities for diasporic peoples to experience a sense of a collective identity outside of being the other. The artists whose works are used as case studies are Kanon, Shad, Ian Kamau, and Chaos. For today, I will focus mainly on Kanon, who is a Somali-Canadian hip-hop artist who was born in Somalia and emigrated to New York prior to moving to Toronto, and Shad, who is a Rwandan-Canadian hip-hop artist who was born in Kenya prior to moving to London, Ontario. Each of these musicians engaged their work with the difficult questions concerning the slippery language of popular culture and national belonging. In doing so, they explore the tensions that are inherent in attempting to dismiss their publicly fixed positions as the other immigrant versus their experienced multiplicity as diasporic fluid subjects. I suggest that Black diasporic Canadian hip-hop challenges popular representations of Canadian nationalism as accepting in 4 ways. The first is through maintaining political and social ties to their diasporic roots. The second is through lyrical representation of inherited experiences of trauma. Third, through familiar relations that heighten each artist's critical awareness of their blurred identity. And fourth, through presenting their struggles that they face in not fully ascribing and assimilating to Canada as their homeland and space of belonging. Of the artists chosen for examination, Kanon has achieved the most mainstream success. In popular media, he is often defined as Somali first and secondly as Canadian. This hyphenation of Kanon's identity silently recognizes his elsewhere as the place within which he has a difficult relationship, and Canada as the desired location wherein opportunity and success are available, but fails to identify the construction of him as not being quite citizen. Rather than denying and silencing their occupation of complex positions, artists like Kanon use hip-hop to develop imagined communities that resist the limited currency of multiculturalism, as it's not a match for his poetry that fails to be discreet, travels across the earth and seas, and knows no boundaries. In an interview about his life in Toronto, Kanon comments on the types of belonging available to the nation for immigrants. He states, quote, Coming to Toronto, it was great, you know. Here was a place where you weren't in a war, great quality of life, a picturesque city, good culture, opportunities, schools. This is like textbook Toronto, and it's great, but you have to understand that that's relative. Those check boxes and dreams are relative in Canada. They don't belong to everybody equally all the time. And so when you are an immigrant and a black immigrant with no means, you are at the mercy of society, and those check boxes no longer apply to you. Despite the fact that Canada is publicly assumed to be an accepting nation, Kanon disrupts this national narrative by rapping about his experiences. What sets him apart is his nostalgia for his cultural and linguistic home. His ability to translate this music is telling of how national multiculturalism fails because it focuses on the urgency to integrate immigrants or refugee populations into the national body and ends up overlaying refugee populations with discourses of racial difference that ultimately produce negative effects. The songs Somalia and America portray Kanon's migration patterns and address the failures of national suturing efforts. The song Somalia begins with children singing with what sounds like a Somali-inspired melody and carries into verses and a chorus that nostalgically recall Kanon's tribulations of growing up in Somalia. Strategically, Kanon deconstructs popular imaginings of Canada as an opportunistic final destination for traumatized peoples by rhyming.
Do you see why it's amazing when someone comes out of such a dire situation and learns the English language just to share his observation? Probably get banned without a grammar education. So fuck you school and fuck you immigration.
Kanon acknowledges the fact that he was lucky to leave Mogadishu, learn the English language by listening to hip-hop music, and yet is still unable to belong to Canada due to institutions that attempt to regulate him into the acceptable silent immigrant position. Rather than silencing himself for limited acceptance to a nation that will always view him as a fragment, he chooses to express his voice and fluid identity. What successfully allows Black diasporic Canadians to identify with Kanon is his manipulation of the English language. In choosing to publicly use all of the Englishes he grew up with rather than water down his thoughts, Kanon affirms his identification as a diasporic person through emotive creolizations of the nation's dominant language. In doing so, he acknowledges the importance of broken English for diasporic communities as it reflects the difficulty of belonging anywhere but in between. In America, Kanon continues to distance himself from the project of multiculturalism by allying himself with the Somali diaspora. The chorus of the song, which is sung in Somali, translates in English to "Remember us fleeing, searching for peace. In America, none was found." Language becomes the tool of Kanon's trade. He uses language to tackle difficult subject matter and ensure that his message is clear for the audience it concerns. Kanon appropriates tools of isolation that he learned from Canadian national narratives and reverses the othering project onto the nation itself so that the diaspora becomes dominant in the space of time of the song, and those who do not understand the language are excluded. Ian Kamau develops a connection to Kanon by borrowing the Ethiopian jazz beat that Kanon samples from Tilahun Gesese, a song titled Lanche Bie. So this is the song that both artists sample. Kamau creates his own song to discuss struggles that he both experiences and sees in Toronto, and further emphasizes the idea that exclusionary practices are evident in the North, thus renaming the track North America. Kamau opens the track with a shout out to Kanon, so he clearly identifies his connection to him.
Speaking in your ear, I try to find peace. I'm not sure if it is here, so mixed emotions. I'm calling this my home. I feel a little off. I'm not sure if I'm alone. So my only vice is considered right at home, because they speak and make decisions like they sitting on the throne, pushing poor people out to Toronto with some pity, and all they want to do is build condos in the city. Life is so sweet, also a bitter pill. Plans for region park, not far from Africa.
Kamau aligns. You can go ahead. Kamau aligns his song to the same project of exposing the failing cultural mosaic and notes that the erasure of Black diasporic communities is not new by referencing the tragedies that occurred in Africville. Overall, Kanon has dedicated his music to address the expose the failing cultural mosaic and notes that the erasure of Black diasporic communities is not new by reference. Oh, whatever. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to just move on to Shad quickly. Sorry about that. In a 2010 interview, Shad was asked why he had named his new album at the time TSOL. Rather than giving a definite answer, Shad suggests that the title doesn't stand for any one thing, and that he, just like the sound of it, it represents the insufficiency of language to express feelings and ideas, which is why we have art. It can stand for a number of things. It's representative of the ambiguity of life in a certain way. So in doing so, an individual simultaneously realizes that they are a part of an imagined community that listens to the same music and feels the passion and experiences the same difficulties of being in between. Although the interview focuses on his second album, the song that I want to talk about is titled I'll Never Understand from his album When This Is Over. Shad participates in what Marianne Hirsch terms post-memory. Hirsch defines post-memory as the relationship that children of survivors of cultural or collective trauma have in relation to the experiences of their parents' experiences that they remember only as narratives and images with that which they grew up, but that are so powerful that they adopt them as their own. So these inherited memories unintentionally act as a source for further frustration and separation from national narratives of belonging because they erase the home that they or their families once came from. So Shad explores how post-memory can be used in this song by layering both his own story with his mother's story of experiencing the Rwandan genocide that happened in the mid-1990s. So. So the first three verses of the song are using Shad's mother, Bernadette Cabango's haunting poetry, performed in her ironically soothing voice, which makes her experiences of trauma surreal. Her emphasis on certain words use the present participle to emphasize that these images of terror still haunt her and the next generation of her family through post-memory. The memories of trauma that haunt Shad himself are his mother's experiences, but he hasn't, but can promise how he views Rwanda. It can never be the same home to him as it was to his mother, but at the same time, the nation that he grew up in and knows best as home does not exist for him, as the majority of its population has no clue of the terror that the stories and memories of back home have caused him. Shad's inability to understand either position allows him to develop imagined communities for people of the in-between, as it is where he exists as well. Although a diasporic listener's narrative may not be as traumatic as that of Cabango's, they can relate to the intergenerational post-memory as what has estranged them from identifying to any specific location as home. Instead of searching for physical spaces of belonging, listeners belong to the imagined spaces developed by music that dispels the fictions of what home and nation mean. Canadian hip-hop music has generally been dismissed as partial in comparison to its American counterpart due to arguments that Canada does not have an independent form of popular culture. Through this research, I hope to have begun the process of debunking this myth and note that much more work is still needed. It's important that academia recognize the role of Black diasporic Canadian artists in order to gain insight into the problems that diasporic peoples face in Canada and how they cope with them. These artists, as well as Black diasporic Canadian hip-hop artists before them, used the hip-hop genre to artistically voice and examine the tense space that their fluid identities occupy while constantly struggling to belong. Music becomes the tool to map imagined communities of belonging for outsiders, insiders of the nation, and establish a sense of collectivity that form offshoots that challenge orderly systems and stress the importance of the in-between. As the title of my paper suggests, through hip-hop music, these artists, those before them, and potential artists of the future will produce poetry that hails within the streets and poetry that fails to be discreet in order to claim space for diasporic communities to belong to imagined communities that are adrift in the in-between. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola Mohammed. I'll now open the floor for questions from the audience. There are 2 microphones located in the aisles. Please use these microphones in order to address your questions to the panelists.
So if anyone wants to come up to either this microphone or that microphone, just step up and ask your question.
Yeah, my name is Timmy. Recently finished from the University of Toronto in my MBA. And my question is for Del and I guess Maestro as well, since he's here. Now, Let Your Backbone Slide, I think it was a pretty big hit in the US as well, or at least got some attention in the US. So I want to know what happened behind the scenes from a business angle, how they took a song that was big here in Canada. How did they get that over in the States?
So sorry, you wanted to know how it was, how it became.
Yeah, how it got just attention in the States from like a business standpoint, like
right.
I guess who are the people behind the scenes that made that happen?
Or you mean in terms of the success of this? Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
If
I'm going to try and answer that based on how I interpret it, and Maestro can probably add and probably totally undermine everything I say. I'm just joking. But I mean, essentially, what I do feel though, in terms of the actual success, well, first of all, Maestro was signed by a New York label. The record was actually, he got signed based off a performance on Electric Circus, right? Yes. So there was an artist who you may know, Stevie B, who kind of, a freestyle artist back in the day, who kind of was on a label that Maestro eventually got signed to. And he was at Electric Circus that day performing and basically kind of, passed on his name. And I guess things kind of went from there. So he was signed in the States. So actually what's kind of ironic is that the record was available in Toronto first as an import, even though he was from here. And that just kind of goes back into that whole back and forth kind of situation that I was kind of talking about earlier. I do believe that the record was, successful. They did chart on Billboard, I think, on a Billboard rap chart, but compared to the success the success primarily was here in terms of, and also the pioneering success of it, like I guess was unprecedented here, I guess, if you know. In terms of, so I think that's the business. I don't know if that's the business angle you're talking about, but in terms of like being signed and all that kind of stuff, that's kind of what I know about it.
Thank you to all of our speakers today. The paper's really great. Thank you. I have 2 questions. One that will be for everyone, so I hope that each and every one of you can speak to this point, because all of you kind of highlight how hip-hop is able to flush out issues of identity within kind of your various groups. So I wanted to know if you can talk a little bit about the Canadian presence within this kind of identity making, more specifically for each of your thing. Is hip-hop or hip-hop in Toronto more specifically have a distinct Canadian presence, and if so, what is that? And if it doesn't, can you speak to why you think it doesn't? My second question is more specific for Ola. You talk more specifically of a heavily male presence kind of in your discussion, and I wanted to know if you can highlight how gender kind of informs this middle kind of ground for diasporic peoples in hip-hop. Thank you.
Yes, please, yeah.
Okay, sorry. First question is, does hip hop in Toronto have a distinctive Canadian presence, more specific to all of the individual people that you're talking about? And if so, what is that? And if not, can you speak to why you think maybe hip hop in Toronto doesn't have a distinctive Canadian presence? Don't all rush at once.
Well, I read an interview with Maestro, who answered this, and he could also speak to it if he wants. You should. But it was like a couple months ago, right? The CBC was really low. Just because I think you said there's a scene, there's a hip hop scene, but no industry, because save for Drake and a couple others, there's just so few hip hop artists. And with respect to queer hip hop artists, there are even fewer. I could count on one hand the number of active rappers, DJs. Well, if you include everyone, maybe not one hand, but MCs is definitely like one hand. But there are plenty of parties that go on, and in the major cities like Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto that I've played at, specifically for queer lovers of hip hop. There's a whole like racialized aspect and conflict there with like white queers sort of taking up that sort of appropriating it, and so there's in Toronto specifically the parties get like divided in that way. So.
So I guess the group, I'll just talk about the distinctively Canadian presence. So I guess with, my work was really centered on, it was only centered on one, I only mentioned one rapper, and he is locally Toronto. But talking about Idle No More, I mentioned a few other rappers, and they are from across the nation, so they are talking about this something that is happening in Canada at this moment. But just to step out of Idle No More, each Aboriginal group usually talks about or makes mention of what reserve they're from, or what nation they are part of. So I think that kind of brings it back home. It'll be like me saying, oh yeah, I'm from the T-Dot, so that's kind of the distinctively Canadian part. And I think Indigenous rap in general is very specific geographically. So if you looked at Indigenous rappers in Brazil, they'd be speaking about the favelas, and they'd be speaking about the government in that region. Or if you look at Aboriginal hip hoppers in Australia, huge scene there. So they're talking about, and they even call themselves Black. So there's a whole other dialogue, a whole other language that happens within each geographic region, I think.
I feel like everyone's already kind of covered it. I'll answer your second question. In relation to gender and how it informs this, that's a really difficult question, and that's something that I've struggled with in relation to my project. And I recently spoke at a different conference where we were talking about the role of women in relation to hip hop, and how, like, the role of ourselves within the genre, and how it seems like there's a lot of women who are writing about hip hop music. Like, there's ourselves who are here, but then there's authors like Dream Hampton, and then there's Trisha Rose, and there's an up-and-coming Raheel Tesfaye, who's an online presence. So in relation to artists, for my specific project, it came out of a very personal place, and it was a question that was asked of me in a different class where we had to write a project about in relation to what we relate to. So I think it's important for us to recognize the role of women who are artists, but I haven't in this specific project, and that's something that I do know. I do recognize that I fail at, but I do want to work on that as well. So it's hard. I don't know what to really say to your question about that. Sorry.
Thank you, everyone.
We have 2 more minutes for questions or comments.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for those wonderful papers. I have one question for Ola, and it kind of ties into something which Willie had opened with as well.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? I have one question for Ola, and it kind of ties into something which Willie had said initially about new identities.
I can't hear you.
About new identities and not necessarily feeling as if you belong. And you mentioned forming your own identity around this displacement. This idea that you're trying to find back home, what if back home for you is Canada, right? But you still feel displaced. How does that then get articulated in any kind of Canadian sense? Like you don't necessarily feel Canadian, and back home is this vague, ambiguous, heritage kind of thing. How would you speak to an articulation of that?
That's definitely something that I do discuss in this project. That's one of the things that I was talking about in relation to Shad and this idea of post-memory, where you're inheriting the memories of your family members that have experiences in your homelands, but that you haven't personally experienced. But those memories have so much resonance within yourself because you've heard them so much to the point that you adapt them, and then it develops this sort of difficulty and this tension where you at once you feel at home, but then at the same time you feel this tension because you don't very much connect to a lot of things, and that's what I believe that these artists are doing. And I developed this more with this idea of the rhizome, where there's all these connections that are developing and moving through different places, but it's always this idea of being in the middle, and I think that's what's really important about this music, is that it's speaking of this tension. And I think instead of trying to resolve this idea of the tension, we need to explore this tension and acknowledge it for what it is, right? We can't ourselves explain what it is that we feel, so why not? This music isn't gonna come up with a solidified answer, but it gives us this time and space where we can be like, oh, okay, this is describing what I'm experiencing and this is how I feel. So it helps kind of build this sense of community where you understand that there's no real answer.
Last question.
First of all, thank you very much for all the very articulate points made by all the speakers, and also for the presence of the artists that are also here, for them to be here at this great event. Quick question in regards to Ice Cube, his film, Are We There Yet? I think Ola probably best to answer this question in regards to cultural space and also identity, presence, and citizenship within the scope of Canadian landscape identity. Not only are we there yet, but what will home look like once we're able to create that sense of presence here in a much more holistic and a much more affirmed sense?
Does anyone else want to answer this too? No, just me?
I can add one thing.
Okay, go please.
I don't know, I think this articulation of home, right? I think we are trying to, everyone that's here, Maestro, Mishimi, all those kind of grandfathers and grandmothers of hip hop, Canadian hip hop. I think we are trying to create this this idea of home here, because we're all from, wherever. We need a place to call home. It's a nice, but it's always going to be questioning belonging. Am I Canadian enough? Am I, there was, people are always asking you, where are you from, right? Even though, I'm from here. So, but they want something else. It's something else. It's okay, you don't look like me, or oh, you don't look like someone else. So where are you from? I think trying to create a home that is here, and a scene that is here, and that is distinctly Canadian or Torontonian even. And even if that means speaking about, what Ola was saying, speaking, Shad, speaking about his mother, speaking about, Kanan, speaking about where he's originally from and the histories that come with it. But I think they all can come together and be here. And that can still be a diasporic Toronto, or diasporic Canada.
And just to add to that, I think what makes it this idea of home, in addition to what Aubrey was saying, is the sense that the music is the place of home. This idea that home is in a static place, that there's always going to be this tension between being here and the idea of multiculturalism in Canada being a nation itself that is very problematic. But the idea of having something to turn to, and especially the expressive arts, is something that I believe strongly that these artists are pushing for, this idea of a sense of belonging for communities to have. So it's this imaginative community that I talk about.
I would like to add also that I think sometimes when you think of the word home, you kind of think of comfort and kind of relaxation. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily, no, I'm not sure if that's actually intuitively what hip hop is about. I think it's always going to be querying things. It's always going to be trying to find, areas and things to question. So I mean, I think though, so I think it's kind of like what you were saying. It's kind of, there is a tension there. So that's always going to be there, and I think that's also part of the music, and that's kind of part of what fuels the best type of that music. So I think, I'm not saying that we need to have, unrest to make good hip hop, but I mean, I do think that it's an ingredient that actually, you have to kind of, it kind of looks for things that are, that to query, and I think that has to kind of still be a part of it going into the future.
Okay, thank you to our panelists. We have run out of time. There will be refreshments served outside for the next 15 minutes, and then we'll have our first roundtable panel of the day. Thank you.